Well, most football players never play in the Super Bowl, as you know. The same is true for other occupations that have their version of the Super Bowl. For lawyers, the Supreme Court of the United States is the Super Bowl. Everyone in law school reading those Supreme Court cases when they will stand before the Supreme Court of the United States arguing a case. Winning would be the ultimate dream, but just making it to that version of the Super Bowl separates you from more than 99% of lawyers who will never come close to presenting a case to the United States Supreme Court. Neil Katyal, who will join us tonight, has argued 50 cases to the United States Supreme Court. 50. That means, as I just said, Neil Katyal has written more Supreme Court briefs than I have read. And so I am more than eager to hear Neil Katyal's assessment of the briefs that have been submitted so far in the case of Donald J. Trump versus Norma Anderson et al. That is the name of the case that the Supreme Court will hear next Thursday, with Donald Trump appealing a decision by the Supreme Court of Colorado to ban Donald Trump from the presidential ballot in Colorado on the basis of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which bars anyone from holding federal office if they have betrayed an oath to uphold the Constitution. Today, the Board of Elections in Illinois decided that they don't have the authority to ban Donald Trump from the ballot. They followed the advice of a retired Republican judge on that point. In that judge's report to the Board of Elections, the judge said the evidence presented at the hearing on January 26, 2024, proves by a preponderance of the evidence that President Trump engaged in insurrection within the meaning of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. That will be one of the questions that the Supreme Court will have to resolve. Did Donald Trump engage in an insurrection? Another question the Supreme Court will have to resolve is, does Section 3 of the 14th Amendment apply to Donald Trump? The first words of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment say, no person shall be a senator or representative in Congress or elector of president and vice president or hold any office. The question for the Supreme Court is, does the word office apply to the presidency? Is there any reason to think that the office of the 14th Amendment would not allow a person to become a senator after engaging in insurrection, or a member of the House of Representatives, or even become an elector of a president, a member of the Electoral College? But did they intend to allow a participant in insurrection to become president? Another question before the Supreme Court will be, is Section 3 of the 14th Amendment what lawyers call self-executing? Congress never passed a law specifying a legal process for excluding someone from office on the basis of Section 3. But Donald Trump's lawyers have argued that it is impossible then to bar him from being on the ballot if he has not, at a minimum, been convicted of the crime of insurrection. Like many cases before the Supreme Court, the answers to the questions before the court lie in history. The Republican majority in the Supreme Court all become amateur historians in cases like this, as do their clerks. They go careening through history with the singular mission of finding ways of supporting conclusions they've already reached. The Dobbs decision overturning Roe versus Wade is one of the low points of Supreme Court historical research. Justice Samuel Alito and his clerks decided to rely on the opinions of two English prosecutors, both of whom, presumably unbeknownst to Justice Alito, were very proud prosecutors of witches and strong advocates of the death penalty for witches 400 years ago, which one of them enforced as a judge. So the most important Supreme Court opinion of the 21st century relies on the thinking of two Englishmen who 400 years ago believed in and prosecuted witches, urging that they be put to death. That's how bad the Supreme Court can be in its use and abuse of history. The ahistorical Alito side of the Supreme Court is facing a higher authority this time on history. This week, the Supreme Court received a brief in the case from America's highest authorities on the history of the 14th Amendment. Jill Lepore, professor of history at Harvard University, David Blight, professor of history and African American studies at Yale University, Drew Gilpin-Faust, a historian and former president of Harvard University, who is now a Harvard University professor, and John Fabian Witt, professor of law at Yale Law School. If I can recommend one Supreme Court brief for you to read in your life, let it be this one, because it is relatively short at 34 pages with plenty of white space. It is clearly written, as clearly written as a Supreme Court brief can possibly be, because it doesn't rely on the technicalities of law. The four professors who contributed to this brief are all authors of beautifully written books, easy-to-read books. This is the kind of brief that high school students could easily read, have no challenges reading this. If you have a junior high school student at home who hopes to maybe go to law school someday, or just as a bright junior high school student, this is great reading. Great reading for those students. They will have no challenges comprehending any of this. This brief sets out to convince the Supreme Court of this proposition on page 4. Its framers intended Section 3, 1, to automatically disqualify insurrectionists, 2, to apply not only to the Civil War but also to future insurrections, and 3, to bar anyone who has betrayed an oath to uphold the Constitution from becoming President of the United States. As to Section 3 applying to future insurrections, the answer to that is on page 3 of the brief, quoting Senator Benjamin Butler in the debate on the 14th Amendment, saying, "This is to go into our Constitution and to stand to govern future insurrection as well as the present." The brief tells the story of how the 14th Amendment prevented Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederate States of America, from even attempting to run for the Senate or run for the presidency of the United States after the Civil War. The brief tells the story of members of the Confederacy who were barred from holding federal office automatically and without trial. Quote, when the Democrat Alexander H. Stephens, the former vice president of the Confederacy, was elected to the U.S. Senate, the clerk of Congress refused to call the names of the ex-Confederates at roll, and they were never seated. Simple as that. Before drafting the 14th Amendment, a special joint committee of Congress heard testimony from 145 witnesses. The historian's brief presents the testimony of J.W. Alvord, who was questioned about the conditions he found in the southern states. Question, now state what among the rebel people is the general feeling towards the government of the United States? Answer, it is hostile. As it seems to me, in the great majority of the Southern people, I mean that part of them who were engaged in the rebellion, there is evidently no regret for the rebellion, but rather a defense of it. Question, what great object do they seem to contemplate in their being readmitted to Congress by their senators and representatives? Answer, they seem to suppose that by readmission, they can get political power and obtain again the supremacy which they once had. And with the exception of slavery, they expect to be still a prosperous and dominant portion of our government. Slavery they have given up in the old form, but they want to subdue and keep in a low place the Negroes by some compulsion, which it seems to me they are trying to effect not only privately, but by all the legislation that I learned of or witnessed. A tax commissioner was asked if they could have their way, would the rebel people generally remain in the Union? The tax commissioner answered, no. I think they have a stronger aversion and dislike of the Union than when they seceded. That is what the 14th Amendment was aimed against, the Southern insurrectionist spirit that was still strong. John Bingham, a member of the Joint Committee, said, unless you put them in terror of your laws, made efficient by the solemn act of the whole people to punish the violators of oaths, they may defy your restrictive legislative power when reconstructed. John Bingham wanted to invoke the terror of our laws to punish the violators of oaths. The historian's brief says Bingham and his colleagues did not intend it as a political measure to fit their historical moment alone. This legislation will be felt, he said, by generations of men. Thousands of members of the Confederacy believed that Section 3 of the 14th Amendment applied to them and was self-executing, and they proved that belief by sending petitions to Congress asking for the ban against them holding office to be lifted by a two-thirds vote of Congress. The historian's brief says, by 1872, Congress estimated the number of petitioners at 15 or 16,000. The newspapers at the time were full of articles expressing gratitude for Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, preventing Jefferson Davis from ever becoming president of the United States. The historian's final line of their brief says that the authors of the 14th Amendment knew that no one in the United States is above the law, not even the president, and that no Republican government can afford to return insurrectionists to office. Leading off our discussion tonight is David Blight, professor of American history and African American studies at Yale University, and one of the co-authors of this brief. Professor Blight, we invited a couple of your other historian colleagues who joined you on this brief, but they couldn't make it tonight, so it's all up to you. The pressure's on you to represent them all in this argument to the Supreme Court. What is your hope that the Supreme Court will focus on? If there's a singular point for them to focus on here, what are you hoping for?
Well, one can hope that they will do as we did, dig down into the actual history of how Section 3 came about, its origins in time, its drafting at the end and right after the war, and then its meaning and consequences in its afterlives. That's what one can hope. I do want to say your description of our brief was actually very moving. You did a great summary. It's almost as moving as this solemn moment that our country has to face now in the coming weeks with this Supreme Court case. But what we did is we dug into this question of oaths, and we found that this was an era of oath-taking. They were obsessed with oaths because of secession. And then we dug into the Second Confiscation Act, which turns out to name disqualification and even death as the punishment for violating your oath and committing treason against the United States. There were lots of precedents before they actually were drafting Section 3 by 1866. And we tried to show in as graphic terms as we could in this limited space that the Congress doing this, the Republicans in that Congress doing this, gathered evidence from the Joint Committee on Reconstruction, gathered evidence from correspondence to congressmen and senators, gathered evidence from petitions from 1866. There were dozens and dozens of petitions from at least 8 northern states, hundreds or thousands of people signing them, begging Congress. This was a form of popular sovereignty, begging Congress, please disqualify ex-Confederates. Don't let them do this again. And then we really dug into, to answer that question about, was this intended to include the president? I mean, it is nonsensical, to be frank, to argue that it didn't include the president, because they were writing this with Jefferson Davis on their mind, and any other ex-Confederate that might declare a candidacy for the president. And they made sure, even after the pardons and the amnesties that happened in 1870 and 1872, even the final amnesty enacted had a clause in it that said anybody who had been a member of the Congress or the Senate from 1859 to 1863, which included Jefferson Davis, shall be exempted from these amnesties. They were very concerned to protect the presidency itself from previous insurrectionists. It is simple as that.
You know what I love about this brief is this is really graduate level history, to put it mildly, by some of our greatest historians, you and Professor Lepore, Professor Faust, and it is so accessible. It is so easily readable, which is not what people expect from our great scholars. They expect this kind of dense prose, and so thank you for that. I wasn't surprised. Having read you and having read Professor Faust, I was not surprised at that. But one of the things that is so powerful about it is this sense of discovery the reader has when reading it. And I'm wondering, did you discover, you are one of the greatest authorities available on this subject. Did you discover anything in the writing of this brief?
Well, let me first give a lot of credit here to Jill Lepore. She was our Sherpa. She was our leader through this and our intrepid taskmaster, as was an attorney at the Public Rights Project, Jonathan Miller, who sort of ushered us into putting the thing in the right form of an amicus brief, because none of us, I've signed an amicus brief before, but I never wrote one. Yes, I discovered, for example, all those petitions coming in from the North. I didn't know about that. And when you go back, and I had read a lot of these debates in Congress before 1866, the drafting of the 14th Amendment, it is amazing to read their own language. They are so determined and so concerned, even as they don't all agree on the final wording, to prevent ex-Confederates from ever again setting foot inside the government. And they went to great ends, not just to say those who are disqualified because they violated their oath, but aiding and abetting, a language they actually drew from the Second Confiscation Act of 1862, if you aided or abetted that rebellion. And then also, the more one reads these letters, these testimonies that flow into Congress from Freedmen's Bureau agents and others in the South in 1866 and 67, where they are saying, hey, the rebellion here is not over. Secession is alive and well, rampant, somebody said. If you don't act to safeguard this process, there will be no Reconstruction. And and again, John Bingham is a voice among the voices on all of this. He kept saying to them that Reconstruction would only be as good as its laws. And by the way, this notion of the permanence of Section 3 is all over the evidence. They intended this to be a safeguard for future use. Now, little could they anticipate exactly what's going to happen in the future, of course. But people are even arguing that January 6th, though not identical by any means to the Confederacy, is just as dangerous. After all, the Confederates never entered Washington, D.C. They never invaded the actual capital. On January 6th, people did. We actually tried very hard here to not make a political argument in this brief. We just tried to lay out straightforwardly, as historians are supposed to do, the evidence as it appeared. Now, at times you may find our voice slipping into an argument that falls obviously on one side of this, but evidence always falls on one side or the other. We tried to stay in our lane and let those who would read this understand, here's how this section came about that we're all suddenly talking about. Here's what it meant. Here's why they did it. And here were its consequences. And here were the ways they safeguarded it for the future.
Well, I can only hope that Supreme Court justices approach this with the humility that you and your colleagues approached it. You obviously went into it willing to learn things you did not yet know about a subject we all think you've mastered. We all think you know everything about it.
No, every time I wade into this constitutional history with my friends like John Witt as my guides, well, for one thing, I wish I'd gone to law school and got a law degree so I really could know what I'm talking about, but at least I'm discovering a whole new field for me that this crisis is giving us. But it is a crisis. The country faces now, and by the way, the country faces a crisis that is political, obviously. And one of the arguments, as you well know, Lawrence, about this decision the court faces is the political one. You know, what if What if you take the right to vote for somebody away from people? Should the Supreme Court do that? Are they haunted by Bush v. Gore in that sense? Well, again, the framers of this clause in the 14th Amendment said, well, John Bingham said, I'll give you this last little Bingham quote. There are men now in these halls who may learn when it is too late that the ballot in the hands of conspirators may be more dangerous than the ballot. Now, we don't like voter suppression, but taking the ballot away from people who wish to put insurrectionists back into power, they were saying, is as dangerous as was the insurrection itself. Now, every political moment in history is full of judgments for sure. But if Section 3 is to survive in the 14th Amendment, and for that matter, a lot of the very meaning of the 14th Amendment, the court has to take some kind of position on this that on the one hand, I would hope doesn't ruin their own reputation, but on the other hand, gives us some sense of stability and a way to work through this.
Yale Professor David Blight, thank you very much for another of your contributions to history in this brief, and thank you for the assistance you're offering the Supreme Court. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Len.
Thank you. Well, now that we've heard from an esteemed historian, we will hear from an esteemed Supreme Court practitioner. Neil Katyal joins us next. The last page of the historian's brief to the United States Supreme Court says, as Missouri Republican John B. Henderson declared the day he cast his vote for the 14th Amendment in the Senate, the language of this section is so framed as to disenfranchise from office the leaders of the past rebellion, as well as the leaders of any rebellion hereafter to come. Joining us now is Neil Katyal, former acting U.S. Solicitor General. He's an MSNBC legal analyst and host of the podcast Courtside with Neil Katyal, and he has written and argued 50 cases before the United States Supreme Court, 5-0. Neil, the collection of briefs that we have now from the parties and from these amicus briefs is really quite astonishing, and the historian's brief really is like no other I've read. I'm sure you've read briefs like it, but it really surveys in such an economical way exactly the history that the court needs to focus on.
Yeah, exactly, Lawrence. I mean, Donald Trump has tried, a criminal defendant, Donald Trump, has tried to pretend that it's only lawful liberal activists who think it should be taken off the ballot with this Supreme Court case. But brief by brief, we've seen him proven wrong. I mean, these are respected historians. That's, the Professor Blight brief that we've been talking about on the show today. But there's also top briefs by top constitutional scholars, and briefs by steadfast conservatives like Judge Ludig. And they all say Trump should be disqualified.
I think we've got a problem with Neil's connection right now. I don't know if we're going to be able to fix that. Neil, he's back. Okay, well, when he's back, just put him right up on the screen. You don't have to tell me in my ear. Neil, go ahead. I think we have you back.
I'm sorry, yeah, I don't know where I cut out there, but I was saying that Trump's basically tried to pretend it's a bunch of liberal activists who are against him on this Supreme Court 14th Amendment case. But brief by brief, we've seen he's proven wrong. There's respected historians like Professor Blight, there's top constitutional scholars, and there are steadfast conservatives like Judge Ludig, and they're all saying that Donald Trump should be disqualified. And it's hard to ignore this number of diverse, qualified voices.
In each of these briefs offer, I find, something valuable about a particular point. For example, the definition of what it means to engage in an insurrection, especially where the 14th Amendment says engaged in or given aid or comfort during an insurrection. And we have a brief by these two law professors, they're brothers, and they talk about Trump sits on his hands, smiling as the chaos erupts around him. They cite that as a very clear version of participating in an insurrection. They say that insurrections often involve a complex combination of devious actions and inactions. And they emphasize the Trump inactions as proof of his participation.
Right, Lawrence. I believe you're referring to the briefs by Akil and Vic Amar, who are two constitutional scholars, and they recite a whole bunch of history to totally put to rest this idea that Donald Trump has, which is that you have to engage in an insurrection just like the Civil War, and nothing else qualifies under the 14th Amendment. What the Amar brief says, what the Professor Blight brief says, what Sean Willents, the Princeton professor, has said today in the New York Review of Books, reciting all of the evidence from the time of the 14th Amendment, is no way. They wrote something broader on purpose. The 14th Amendment wasn't just about the Civil War. It was about making sure that people who are insurrectionists or who give aid to comfort are not able to be voted for.
And on this self-executing issue, Neil, it is very clear in the historian's brief that everyone in the country, North and South, believed it was self-executing, that you simply could not hold office if you had participated in the Confederacy.
That's exactly right. So this idea of self-execution, I know it sounds technical, but the basic point, what Trump is saying is the 14th Amendment doesn't mean anything by itself. You need Congress to pass a law to implement the 14th Amendment, which is kind of crazy if you think about it, Lawrence, because the 14th Amendment has some of our most foundational guarantees, like equal protection of the laws, which gave us Brown versus Board of Education and so much else. You don't need a law of Congress to implement it. It's a constitutional command. Now, it is true that Justice Chase, one justice on the Supreme Court, thought that Congress needed to pass a law in one of the more discredited decisions ever by that one justice. And a whole bunch of scholars, including conservative scholars like Bill Bowd at University of Chicago and Michael Stokes Paulson, have said this argument has nothing to it. It would just undo what the 14th Amendment is all about.
And the historians, while they're at it, point out that Justice Chase actually had two opinions about this. That was the second one. His first version of it was different. And that's the kind of detail you get with the way they dig into this.
Exactly. And I think, that's one of the hard things as we go into the Supreme Court oral argument next week. As you've noted, I've been there a bunch, including in some of these big historical laden cases. And it is hard for advocates sometimes to keep the focus on the history. And, my hope, and I think I share exactly what Professor Blight said, my hope is the Supreme Court justices will dig into the history, to use his phrase, because the history is overwhelmingly against Donald Trump. So Trump wants to point to everything else under the sun except history, even though notably history was the method that he claimed to use when picking Supreme Court justices. He wanted people who were faithful to the original intent of the Constitution. Well, if you're going to be faithful to the original intent of the Constitution, this is a bad day for Donald Trump, because the original intent, as all of these historians have shown, is very much that Trump fits to a T what the insurrectionists and the aid and comforters are at the time of the 14th Amendment. Those drafters, Donald Trump fits that to a T.
Neil Katyal, thank you very much for joining us once again. We always learn something.
Thank you.
Thank you. And now that Donald Trump is desperately afraid of attacking E. Jean Carroll, he is busy attacking our next guest, Sean Fain. Presidential campaigns use surrogate speakers to go around the country to speak to audiences who the candidate might never get to. The campaigns try to get some of those surrogate speakers on TV shows like this one. Those surrogates are usually senators or governors or members of the House of Representatives. As the month of January comes to a close, the first month of real presidential campaigning by the Biden-Harris campaign, they have found a new surrogate speaker who is the very best surrogate speaker of the month. Sean Fain, the president of the United Auto Workers, and he proved that when he introduced President Biden at a union conference in Washington, D.C., and delivered the United Auto Workers union endorsement.
In 2019, our members were out there holding the line at GM on a national strike for 40 days. Trump was the sitting president. He said nothing. He did nothing, not a damn thing, because he doesn't care about the American worker. Now, here's what Trump did to help the American auto worker in our 2023 historic stand-up strike now that he's running for president. He went to a non-union plant, invited by the boss, and trashed our union. That's right. And here is what Joe Biden did during our stand-up strike. He heard the call, and he stood up, and he showed up. He joined us in solidarity on the picket line for the first time in our nation's history. A sitting president has ever done that. He said on live national TV that the big three, and I quote, should go further to ensure that record corporate profits mean record contracts for the UAW and the workers. So that's a choice we face. It's not about who you like. It's not about your party. It's not this bullshit about age. It's not about anything but our best shot at taking back power for the working class. UAW, UAW, UAW. Donald Trump is a scab. If Donald Trump ever worked in an auto plant, he wouldn't be a UAW member. He'd be a company man trying to squeeze the American worker.
Sean Fain will join us next. I'll read Donald Trump's attacks on him and let Sean Fain respond to Donald Trump. That's next.
Joe Biden has a history of serving others and serving the working class and fighting for the working class, standing with the working class. Donald Trump has a history of serving himself and standing for the billionaire class, and that's contrary to everything that working class people stand for.
Joining us now is United Auto Workers President Sean Fain. Thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having me, Lawrence.
And thank you, apparently, for bringing Donald Trump along as a viewer, because he's tracking, I guess, everything you say on TV. There you were on CBS on Sunday morning, and Donald Trump wrote this about that. He's on his Truth Social thing. He said, "I had the great privilege of watching Sean Fain, the president of the United Auto Workers, this morning on Deface the Nation. He is a real stiff." Stiff is in capital letters, so I guess he really means it. Who is selling the automobile industry right into the big, powerful hands of China. I assume you have no response to that.
Look, this is just Donald Trump and who Donald Trump is. He always resorts to name calling because at the end of the day, he doesn't want people to focus on facts. You know, during his presidency, we learned a new phrase. It was called alternative facts, which what we all call lies. But that's the world he operates under because he doesn't want people to see the reality of where he really stands. He serves the billionaire class, the corporate class. And so, you know, he doesn't want us to focus on facts, just as we did in our contract campaign with the big three. You know, we put the facts out there. That's why 75% of America, you know, sided with us in that fight, because those are the issues that matter to Americans, to the majority of Americans. You know, it's better pay, better wages, you know, health care security, retirement security, and just getting our time back, getting our lives back, not having to work 7 days a week, 12 hours a day, or multiple jobs just to scrape to get by. That's the economy Donald Trump dreams of.
Let me read you what Donald Trump said about you today. And this is a clear effort to undermine your relationship to the membership of your union. It's a clear effort by Donald Trump to get the votes from members of your union by speaking to them this way. He says, Sean Fain, this is today, Sean Fain is a weapon of mass destruction on auto workers in the automobile manufacturing industry in the United States. Is he under contract to China? Now, that is aimed directly at your membership to try to get their votes and to try to eventually get them to vote against you as their union president.
Yeah, look, you know, the only weapon of mass destruction against the automobile industry in America and all industry in America is two words: corporate greed. And that's what Donald Trump's all about. I mean, this is the oldest tactic in the book. It's divide and conquer. This is what the billionaire class and the wealthy do masterfully. They want to divide the masses over race or what color your skin is, gender, you know, who somebody loves, or even border security. We hear a lot about that recently. You know, they want to put a villain out there. They want to create whatever boogeyman they can, to make us fear somebody else, like they're going to take something or they're a threat to our being. They're not. The only threat to our being is what we've witnessed the last 40 years of our lives, where the rich gets richer, the poor get poorer, the working class continues to struggle to get by. That's the economy they love. You know, this is about humanity. And the sad reality is the world Donald Trump wants, they want to talk about competition. They want us to compete with countries that pay poverty wages. And basically, they want a society of slavery. That's their ultimate goal. And we're not going to stand for that. So we're not going to let, our membership's smarter than that. They think working class people are stupid. They're not. Working class people get it. And when you put the facts in front of them, the facts are very clear about which candidate looks out for working class people and stands with workers, and which candidate has spent a lifetime serving himself, and that's Donald Trump.
Are the facts enough, Sean, among the Trump voters who you know, and I know you talk to, I mean, I know Trump voters, I haven't found that the facts are very persuasive to them.
Well, I mean, Trump lives in an alternate reality. I mean, let's be real. I mean, he's devoid of fact because fact doesn't feed the narrative that he wants people to believe in. But I do believe, when you look at our contract campaign, you look at our strike with the big three, there's a reason why 75% of American public sided with us in that fight. And those are the issues people care about. People want their lives back. And so, they want a decent wage, and they want to be able to have a job and have a secure retirement where they can someday have an end and actually enjoy their life. Our lives shouldn't revolve around work, and that's the society we live in this country now. Every minute of our day is structured around work. Both parents have to work in a two-family home, or one. If it's one parent, they're working multiple jobs, and that's not a life. And so I do believe when you look at the facts and look at the reality of where both candidates stand, that will resonate with people. But we have to talk about it. We have to keep the dialogue out there.
Joe Biden has announced, the campaign's announced he's coming to Michigan on Thursday. He's going to celebrate and emphasize that UAW endorsement. Is the UAW...
Trump had the same opportunity in 2019 when GM was on strike for 40 days and he was president. What did he do? What did he say? Nothing. President Biden worked with us, to save a community in Belvedere, Illinois. It was written off for dead. A plant was going to close. Their administration worked with us. We were able to get not just that plant saved, but get a second plant, commitment for a second plant there. Donald Trump, when he was president in 2019, faced the same situation in Lordstown, Ohio. And he did nothing. And he told those workers, don't sell your houses. And he did nothing but blame the local president at the time. You know, you go back into bankruptcy and back in the recession in 2008 and 9. Joe Biden stood with the American worker and worked for a path forward for us. You know, Donald Trump said, let him fail. And he blamed the workers, you know. So there's two very distinct people in this fight. You know, Joe Biden has a history. He bet on the American worker. Donald Trump blamed the American worker. And that's a very clear choice to me in where working class people should stand in this election.
President Shawn Fain of the United Auto Workers, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll be right back. Shawn Fain gets tonight's last word. The 11th hour with Stephanie Ruhle starts now.